going back to the Shangri-La dialogue, Zelensky was there giving a speech. Now, my understanding, the purpose for him to be there is to convince more countries, Asian countries, to join this peace conference that they talked so much about. But one of the things I don't quite understand is that he seems um, get out of his ways to please the Marcos Jr., the Philippines. So he apparently he was trying to get to to talk to Marcos during the conference, and then Marcos left. Marcos giving a speech, and then he left. Bullying in China, etc. And then he left, and then Zelensky went all the way to Philippines to talk to him to convince him to join the peace conference. And to the degree that he even saying, we support the Philippines and this and that, which is, I mean, what he did upset China. I have to say, I don't quite understand why did he do that. You see, people think China is, unwavering support for Russia. That has not been always the case. Before the war, China and Ukraine had a good relationship. But I think a few months before the war broke, China and Russia and Ukraine actually signed some kind of a cooperation for their infrastructure agreement, which is a pretty big one. And they were planning. China was planning to invest in Ukraine big time, etc. And of course, all that got stopped once the war starts. So China does have nothing against Ukraine. In fact, I think the fact that China trying to China trying to be neutral about this simply because China feel bad for the situation.
Yeah.
But Zelensky is now doing things clearly upside China. He doesn't understand the situation that you upset China does not serve anything. I mean, what does he get from Marcos Jr. from the Philippines?
It's a very good question. You are absolutely correct. I mean, China and Ukraine had a good relationship. China was a major investor in Ukraine. There was a major company in Ukraine called Mortosich, which I'm quite familiar with, which used to produce gas turbines. It doesn't produce anything now, but it did used to produce gas turbines. It was built up by the Soviet Union. The Russian market was its principal market. It lost that market. China stepped in. It invested in it. It provided new equipment. It got Mortosich back up and running. And of course, a lot of the gas turbines and the aircraft engines and the helicopter engines were supplied, and the marine turbine engines ended up being supplied to China. And it saved that company. And you could reproduce this in many, many other areas. And China was a big investor in the agricultural system, in all kinds of things that Ukraine was doing. And you're also absolutely right that when the conflict began, China went out of its way to try and keep an equal distance between Russia and China and Ukraine. It didn't supply weapons to Russia. It hasn't been involved in the war in any way. It's proposed a peace conference. It set out a peace principles upon which peace could be negotiated, which some would say was favorable to Ukraine, actually. Now, this is where the fundamental difference between between Ukraine and Russia is, because Russia has a real understanding of diplomacy. They have understood very well Chinese sensitivities and constraints here. They've gone out of their way to make it clear to the Chinese that they're not annoyed or angry with the stance that China is taking. On the contrary, they say that they are very grateful to China for being even-handed in the way that it has been, that they find the Chinese proposals interesting and are prepared to work on them. That's what they've done. Now, what the Chinese have now experienced with Zelensky is those like me who have followed the war closely have found is Zelensky's general behavior. He is very erratic. He's extremely emotional. He gets angry all of the time. There was an article a couple of days ago in the Financial Times, which was absolutely searing. It showed how bad his relations at a personal level with some US officials had become. And there were concerns from some other Ukrainian officials about how rude Zelensky is towards some of the Americans. And I think this must have come as a shock to the Chinese to see this man, who is the president of a country at war, behaving like a spoilt child. And of course, the reason he's done this is because China is not attending this conference in Switzerland, which was the brainchild, apparently to a great extent, of Zelensky himself, though the Americans were involved. That peace conference is a piece of absurdity. It's not a peace conference in any meaningful sense. It was an attempt to trick as many countries as possible into lining up against Russia. That was never going to work. It wasn't going to work against Brazil or India or Saudi Arabia, which are also not attending, by the way, or have downscaled their attendance. It was never going to work with China. And Zelensky, when he sees that this is all falling apart, which it was inevitably going to do, he becomes furious, he throws a public tantrum, and he blames China. And he says things about China which are offensive, but also ridiculous. He called China a puppet of Putin. I mean, this is so fantastic. It is so grotesque that even the British media, which usually reproduce everything that Zelensky says and hail it as words of wisdom and genius, well, they were so embarrassed about it that they didn't even publish it because it was so preposterous and absurd. And if you are conducting diplomacy and you are in as much trouble as Zelensky and Ukraine is, you don't go out of your way to insult the people who might help you and who are in fact trying to do so. But I have to say, he's done this with others. He had a meeting a year ago with Prime Minister Modi of India, and apparently Modi left absolutely furious after the meeting. And then he was supposed to have a meeting with the president of Brazil, Mr. Lula, and he failed to turn up to the meeting. And again, Lula was furious. It's just Zelensky.
And I also find it's okay. He's put so much emphasis on his peace conference, and then he's going to participate surely the G7 meetings, and then followed with the NATO meetings, etc. But the one country that he really needs to talk to is Russia, right? But he kept on going to all these places, and in the Shangri-La dialogue of all places. I mean, what does it do to help him? He just cannot talk to Russia, but going over all these places to do what? To build up international, some kind of a way of forcing Russia to something? That's his goal?
It's very difficult to understand, but that does, I mean, to the extent that he talks and explains himself, that is what he says his goal is, that he's trying to assemble some great international coalition. He seems to believe that through sheer force of personality, he can persuade countries around the world to change their established principles of conducting foreign policy and to bend to his wishes. I'm going to say this. Beyond his completely unnecessary rudeness to China and his failure to obviously speak to the Russians, his embrace of President Marcos Jr. was a terrible mistake. I mean, the one thing that Ukraine absolutely should have avoided doing is connecting in the Chinese mind Ukraine's crisis with Russia with the problems that China has in the Asia Pacific region, ultimately with the United States. Zelensky needed to keep a distance between these two. He should have said to the Chinese, look, what issues you have with the Philippines, about Taiwan, that's not my concern. I support China's position on Taiwan. There's one China, because that's always been the Ukrainian position. That's my policy. Don't think that I'm your enemy because I have these problems with Russia, which I know is your friend. I'm nonetheless not bringing these two things together, these two conflicts together, and making it appear that they are one.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he's done instead. He's actually behaved as if the conflict in Ukraine and the conflicts in the Pacific created by the United States in Taiwan and the South China Sea and over the Filipino Islands and all of that, that they really are all part of some great struggle, as Biden says, between the autocracies and the democracies. It was the most stupid thing that he could possibly have done. But I don't think he's a very clever man.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, in particular now, maybe he's just under a lot of pressure. He just lost it, whatever he can get his, anger out or something. I don't know. And then all these talk about striking the targets inside Russia. Now does got me unsettled. And then Keir Starmer, who I guess will be the next prime minister of Britain, he said something he's prepared to use nuclear weapons if needed. I remember Liz Truss said something like that. I mean, they have to say something like that. I don't know, to show they're tough or something. I mean, what do you take on that? Are we slowly walking into World War III? I mean,
well, yes, we are. I mean, it's a disastrous thing. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that there have been proxy wars between the great powers in the past, but always since the end of the Second World War, there's been an understanding amongst all the great powers that there are some things you don't do. And one of the most important things that you don't do is you don't organize attacks by your proxies on the territory and against the people of the other great power. And you saw that, for example, in the Korean War. The United States did not bomb targets in China. I mean, the American Air Force was flying over North Korea, but they didn't cross the border into China. They didn't cross the border into China at the time of the Vietnam War either. They didn't encourage the Mujahideen, insurgents in Afghanistan, to cross the border into the Soviet Union, because they knew this was simply unacceptable. The Soviets, for their part, it was the same. When Castro apparently had all kinds of plans to conduct sabotage operations in Miami and the United States, the Soviets told him very firmly, under no circumstances will you do that. That is not what we do. We are strongly opposed to you doing anything of that kind. So that was the rule. I mean, that was very well understood by all of the great powers. Well, now we are in a situation where the United States and its allies are encouraging one of their proxies, which is Ukraine, to carry out attacks on the territory of another great power, which is Russia, a nuclear power as well. And the Russians, for their part, have said, look, we're aware of what you're doing. This is a terrible thing that you're doing. But we do have a red line. And that red line is this. If you use cruise missiles, not just, rockets, cross-border rockets, but actual cruise missiles to attack our country, ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles, then we will respond. And we might very well respond against your territory. And Putin has said this. I think you should take him completely seriously. For the moment, the Americans have shown some signs that they understand and accept that this is, for the Russians, the absolute red line that cannot be crossed. But they've come right up to the edge of this red line. They're allowing cross-border attacks. It is incredibly dangerous. And those cross-border attacks won't succeed. They won't change the military situation in Ukraine. So why do it at all? Why take these terrifying risks in order to achieve something, to do something, which isn't going to make any military difference. I simply do not understand it. And of course, what it does is that it opens the way for all sorts of people in the West, dangerous and unstable and angry people in the West, to say, well, because, launching just unguided rockets or shells into Russia isn't actually helping Ukraine to win, we've got to go further. And yes, the Russians have said that this is a red line, using cruise missiles, but we can disregard that. We can strike at Russia with cruise missiles, and we'll call that bluff because we assume it's a bluff. We believe it's a bluff, and nothing bad will happen, which I think is completely wrong.
Well, I think you and Alex on your Duran show, you talked about that. It seems like the fact that the Russian exhibit extreme restraint, it seems like they don't take it as such. They take it as weaknesses. And I think it's not just Russia, but China the same, and Iran, right? Whenever I find these countries, China, Russia, Iran, are the countries who are restrained. They are control themselves, to not to do things. But it seems like always being interpreted as weaknesses. It's like we can push more.
Yes.
I mean, isn't that the problem? That these countries almost like you have to react to them now at some point, because otherwise they will keep on and on and on, nonstop.
Well, this is exactly correct, and we're very close to that situation. We're catastrophically close to that situation in the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, I'm going to say I think that some kind of escalation and counter-escalation is going to come. Because this train it's a runaway train. I mean, sooner or later, the Western powers will do something which the Russians feel they have no alternative but to react to. The Russians will be very careful how they respond. They will undoubtedly consult widely, but they will respond because they'll feel that they've been pushed there. But I think we are heading in that direction, given that with every single day, it's becoming clearer that the West and Ukraine are going to lose the war. And with every single day that Ukraine comes closer to defeat, the West's response is to escalate. So sooner or later, some kind of response will come. Now, that is very, very bad, and it's very, very dangerous. But we're now starting to see the same pattern develop with Taiwan and with the South China Sea, and with relations with China, the United States. I was reading a terrifying article in the Wall Street Journal about US Marines conducting exercises on Filipino islands, including one from which allegedly you can actually see Taiwan. I didn't know you could do that, by the way, but apparently you can. And talking about the US preparing for a war with China and demanding, concessions from China in order to avoid that war, was even as at the same time they do everything they can, essentially, to facilitate Taiwanese secession. It's so dangerous. It's so reckless. And again, they've been warned time and again. Xi Jinping has said, that this is the first red line, which must not be crossed. I saw that Dung Tuen, whatever his name, I haven't got his name.
Yeah.
He said exactly the same thing at the Shangri-La conference, and even then they still don't get it, that this is something that the Chinese, when they draw a red line, they mean what they say. And anybody who knows how the Chinese people feel about the whole issue of the unity of their country, which was almost dismantled by the Western powers in the 19th century and then by the Japanese, will know that this is not something that the Chinese are bluffing about at all.
Yeah, that's the problem. Even like I just watched the Mearsheimer. We talk about Mearsheimer, right? That he, I don't know how old this is, but he was saying that China hasn't been having a war since 1979, which means they don't have much experiences. Almost like that means that there's China has a disadvantage if we start a war with China. Well, one thing I mean, I'm sure plenty of people having that view, okay, that it seems like they do believe that China has a lot of disadvantage. But one thing they don't talk a lot about, or they don't understand, is like Ukraine conflict. Even I think in majority in Russia supported Putin's operation, but there's still some people, I guess, very small minority still do not like his policy. But regarding Taiwan, there is none. There
No, I
is
know.
absolutely none. I cannot find a single person privately or openly saying, just let Taiwan go, let Taiwan to be independent. I don't find anyone. This is,
No.
I mean, it's so unified. So people are willing to fight until truly the last person for this. They don't understand that.
No, I
It
don't. I think you're absolutely right. I do think they do understand that. I mean, one must never underestimate the racism that there is, the subcurrent of racism. Chinese don't really mean what they say. You know, we're the mighty United States. We've fought so many wars. The Chinese have fought none. I mean, Professor Mearsheimer is my friend,
Mhm.
but I've never discussed this topic with him. But talking about all of this great experience that the United States has accumulated in war fighting, wars that it has consistently lost. I mean, what kind of experience is that exactly? And if we're talking about a
Mhm.
naval war, of course, the United States has not fought a naval war since the Second World War. It is as uninformed about that as China is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say something because China has developed its navy much more recently than the United States has. And because China has come to this new and fresh, with a fresh mind, I suspect that they have a much better understanding of the relevant technologies than the Americans do,
Mhm.
and were heavily invested in all kinds of types of equipment and big carriers and all of that sort of thing, which might not be particularly well adapted to a war in this region. Now, I'm not a naval strategist by any stretch of the imagination, but I did have a discussion with someone about this who, to some extent, is. And one of the things this person pointed out, for example, is that the Americans have these very big nuclear powered submarines. They're exactly right if you're going to fight a conflict in the North Atlantic with the Russians. If you're going to wage war um, close to Taiwan and in the islands, the South China Sea, then you don't want submarines like that. What you want are smaller, diesel powered submarines, which is, of course, exactly what China has. So, this is, again,
Mhm.
Chinese coming to this with a fresh mind, looking at the problem in a different way, developing their technologies more up to date than those that the United States has.
The Houthis claim they attacked a aircraft carrier,
Yeah,
Eisenhower. That's a big topic in China right now. Lots of discussions.
yeah.
And
It is
so
in
far,
Russia too, by the way.
yeah, so far I haven't seen the US officially deny that. So
No,
that's interesting to me. That just tells you, US is not as good as it's think it is, right?
no.
I mean, that just, but but I watched your conversation this morning with Jeffrey Sachs, right? It's very interesting that he brought up this son, father and daughter father thing. That the father seems like more moderate, like the
Yeah.
Kagan family, right?
Yes.
The sons first, and even the Kalakalas, right? The prime minister of
Yeah.
Estonia. So it seems like their fathers are more moderate, much more
Yeah.
restrained, believing there's a limit for your power. But
Mm.
then the children are not, which reminds me, even Bush Senior and Bush Junior are different, right?
Mm.
Bush Senior is much more limited when they are dealing with the same country, Iraq, right? Bush Senior is much more limited power, limited
Mm.
operation. Whereas Bush Junior is much more all in, right? To take the whole
Mm.
country, etc. I think James Baker, who worked for both of them, he actually probably give us an answer to this. Why, the father and son are different. He worked for both of them. He said that, well, because people ask him why, when you were working for Bush Senior, you didn't all out to go get the whole country. He said, well, that was the situation back then. So we are in a different situation. So what is the difference? I guess because of the Cold War, what's the difference? Right? That's probably what it is. Now, if that's the case, I really think the the fall of the Soviet hurt the whole world in terms of peace because it's a
Uh,
balance, right?
yes, yes. Well, this is becoming a widespread view in some academic circles, by the way, that the Soviet Union, which is in some ways a very conservative country,
Mhm.
that it was in fact the anchor of the international system, that its power was sufficient to restrain the United States. So it kept the United States from doing crazy things and getting itself out of control, whilst at the same time being itself actually not especially aggressive and
Mhm.
rather conservative. So that it was the great balancer. It kept everything in check. And that the moment it was removed from the scene, the whole thing got dangerous and unstable. And of course, in America itself, they all became dizzy with success and drunk with power and unwilling to accept that there were limits to it.
Yeah.